Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Mend the Gap Zoom room and this third in a series of community conversations about and around the Mend the Gap program of work that is primarily hosted at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and with partners in many, many locations around the world. I'm Judy. I'm one of the principal investigators for the Mend the Gap program, primarily responsible with Dr. Tanya Barretto for the ethics and knowledge translation arm of the program of work. I'm professor of neurology here at UBC and director of Neuroethics Canada. As I mentioned, this is the third in a series of community conversations about spinal cord injury and the biomaterials program of work on which we're conducting research. We have committed as part of the program and as part of the ethics and knowledge translation arm to share with you results as they come out of this large program of work. And so we're just delighted to be here with you today. And in as much as we are here for you, you are here for us. What's very important in today's session is for us to engage together in open conversation about some of the results that we'll share with you today about a national survey that we have conducted across Canada and the United States about a biomaterials approach to spinal cord injury intervention. So I really want to invite you after some early remarks from myself and our panelists to engage with us around the questions that we present to you and your views on what we have presented and other questions that you may have about spinal cord injury as it relates to the material that we've shared with you. By being here with us and participating, you are welcome to share your name with us or not, to engage or to ask questions anonymously. You are providing your implicit consent to be here with us. We will never use your names in any form of outreach, but we are going to be recording, and the purpose of the recording is for us to be able to return to the important conversation that we have with you, reflect on it, and use your feedback for the next steps in the research that we'll be sharing with you and that we have ahead of us. When we go into the discussion section, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you wish to speak. We discourage the use of chat just because it gets a little bit chaotic for us as speakers and moderators. But if that is your preferred mode of communicating with us, please go ahead and do that. The chat box will also be recorded, as will the audio part of the session. If we could go to the next slide, please. We always respectfully acknowledge the lands on which we are working, and because we are a large group from many parts of Canada and the world, we invite you to reflect on your place of work and living and appreciate all that it brings to you on a daily basis. I'd like to introduce our speakers now. Dr. Tanya Barretto, who's the project lead for Mend the Gap, based at Neuroethics Canada in Vancouver, Canada. Dr. Jim Guest from the Miami Project from the University of Miami. Thank you so much for being here with us. We hope you are keeping warm with all the weather changes that are occurring around our East Coast in particular. And similarly, welcome Dr. Anita Kaiser from the Spinal Cord Injury Mobility Lab from the University Health Network. And indeed, with you as well, we're happy that we are not doing this in person because probably this would all have had to be canceled due to the snow day. We are very grateful, of course, to all of those who support us. The Government of Canada, who supports the Mend the Gap program through its Frontiers program, as you see here on the slide, as well as our many partners and as well as those who generously share philanthropic support with us. So let me go to the next slide, please. And this is just a basic overview of the kind of work that we are doing through the Mend the Gap program, now in its fourth or fifth year of existence. The goal is to build and seek and build biomaterial bridges to mend the gap that occurs in spinal cord injury when it's incurred, The approach involves combination treatments involving both imaging and injections, and Dr. Barretto will explain a little bit more about that to you in just a moment. But on the right side of the slide, which I hope you can all see, shows you the ethics and knowledge translation trajectory of our work. And here on the ethics side, our deepest goal is to align the values and priorities of people with spinal cord injury and those who care for them and around them to best inform the life sciences and the biosciences approach to mending the gap in spinal cord injury. The logic model shows you some of our studies that have we've been conducting over the past years, and those that we have also published as early back as 2023. And today, as you see in boldface, we'll be talking about preliminary results from the national survey that we conducted. And again, our goal is to share with you what we have found so far, and to gain your feedback to help guide us in moving forward with all aspects of the project. And here our commitment is again to human values and priorities, perspectives from people of different genders, representing the community, sharing with the community, co-developing with the community, and co-communicating. That is really the essence of our community conversation today. So I'm going to invite Dr. Barretto now to go to the next slide and begin her presentation of the results. And overall, the structure here will be about a 10-minute overview of the results. We can go to the next slide, Dr. Barretto. And then 5 minutes of comments, more or less 5 minutes of comments from Dr. Guest and Dr. Kaiser. And then we should have plenty of time for conversation with all of you who have joined us today. Dr. Barretto, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Illes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for taking the time to come to this, and we really look forward to an engaging discussion after this. So our goal with the national survey was to gather input from the spinal cord injury community on the use of a biomaterial or injectable biomaterial intervention to treat spinal cord injury, and that is really to help us guide our research and our clinical translation. So we developed or co-developed this survey with people living with spinal cord injury, scientists, clinicians, and advocacy organizations. The structure of the survey was 34 questions with, demographic questions and then questions relating to the actual intervention, and included both discrete and continuous questions and an invitation for open comment. We disseminated this survey online through Qualtrics, and we sent out the link through our community partners such as SCIBC, Praxis, CSRO, IBCI, and ICORD, and they were, phenomenal in getting this out to the community. And it was online and live for about 4 months from June to September. So what we did was we asked respondents to think back to when they were first injured and to respond to the survey based on what they may have done at the time. So this was the potential scenario that was presented to respondents of the Mend the Gap intervention. So at the time of hospitalization, there would be administration of drugs in conjunction with clinical care. And then at a secondary time point, about 2 months later, there may be a second surgery required to inject the biomaterial into the spinal cord. We highlighted some of the benefits as potential improvements in limb function, bladder and bowel function, and sexual function, and autonomic function, as well as a potential for reduction in pain. We also highlighted some risks that could be associated with this potential intervention, such as additional spinal cord damage, headaches, wound healing complications, infection, and nerve pain. So once we presented the scenario, we then asked a series of questions probing for receptivity towards this proposed intervention, some of the hesitations, and priorities for functional improvement. So this is just generally the demographics of the respondents. So we had 67 people respond with an average age of about 38, and they were on average 10 years post-injury. So the respondents represented diverse injury characteristics in terms of level and severity of injury, as well as race and ethnicity. So we first probed for receptivity towards this using biomaterials to treat spinal cord injury by asking respondents their willingness to participate in a biomaterial clinical trial for SCI. 78% of the respondents said they probably or definitely would participate, and 7% said probably no. So we then wanted to probe a little bit more for reasons for their hesitation by asking why they may not participate. And, unsurprisingly, the risk of losing function was the main reason not to participate, followed by risk of infection and not wanting to undergo a second surgery, as well as, risk of nerve pain. And then there was also general skepticism that the intervention may not be helpful. So, it is not likely that there would be no risks with this intervention at all. So we then asked and tried to probe a little bit for risk tolerance to some adverse events. And so here we have the adverse events highlighted on the x-axis. And then we asked to rate whether they would tolerate or there was low tolerance, medium tolerance, and high tolerance. And so the gray bars represent low tolerance and the blue bars represent higher tolerance. And so, for example, here with spinal cord damage, you see a lot of gray. So there's low tolerance for spinal cord damage as an adverse event compared to, for example, headaches here, where we see a little bit more blue. And so I have laid these out with in the order of low tolerance to high tolerance. And so, in that order, there was very low tolerance to spinal cord damage, infection of the brain or spinal cord, nerve pain, loss of innate recovery, and then on the higher end, wound healing and headaches. So then we asked a bit about what are the functional priorities in relation to the proposed intervention. And so the way we did this was that we listed a bunch of functions and asked respondents to rate them. And so very simply, this is the priority ranking for these functional improvements. And so you can see on the higher end where the biggest priorities are improvements in leg function, hand function, balance, and trunk control, and then, a little bit less of priority in relation to this intervention for pain and spasticity and pressure sores. So then we shifted gears a little bit and then asked about other factors that respondents might have to consider when taking part in this in a trial for such a type of intervention. And, there were two categories that emerged, and they were, social consideration as well as support consideration. So for social considerations, family was the biggest factor to consider, followed by work, and then by leaving one's community. And support considerations included that could influence the decision to participate in this trial was transportation, as there may be multiple steps involved with this. And so going back and forth could be something to consider. Reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses, a personal support worker, and then also for compensation of time off work. So the next thing I'm going to show you is that we looked at some of the open comments and analyzed those. And so respondents' comments really spoke to concerns around risks and benefits. So for example, infection risk and allergies and nerve pain, but especially around the drugs. We can see here, this respondent said that they would want to see the drug being on the market for a minimum of 15 years. So access was another issue that came up or concern that came up. For example, when injured, money becomes a major consideration that would affect their ability to afford travel or relocation. Transparency was another one where, around the procedure, how the procedure is done, the expectations, what the recovery might look like, what supports are in place, and what guidances are being offered. Also around knowledge, where just about the technical aspects of the intervention. and then around justice and the representation of diverse groups of people. And so these results are actually in line with some of our findings from our previous studies in news media and social media studies, where we see that the public is actually really interested in the study details and really want to see transparency around risks and benefits for novel interventions to treat spinal cord injury. And so now I do want to, contextualize our findings with some of the limitations. We had a lot of bot responses, and surveys right now are being inundated with bot responses. So when we became aware of this issue, we worked with Qualtrics to try and mitigate some of that, and that was really helpful. And then it was also about parsing through the results to try and identify which were genuine ones and which were probably bot responses. We also then, asked respondents to think back to the time when they were first injured. And as we've seen in the demographics, that most people had been living with their injuries for about 10 years. So it may not be so easy to ask people to think back and, to respond to questions based on that. And so for moving forward, this is just part one, or the initial part of our consultation, if you may. And that is, soliciting your feedback and then integrating the feedback from you as well as our survey results, and then guiding them into focus groups and interviews where we can really get down into some of the details of what the community would like. And then also to host focus groups that do represent diverse groups of people. And so with that, we have some discussion questions that can maybe help us help us, with our discussion here. So I'm going to hand this back to Dr. Illes.
And so our immediate next step is going to be comments from Dr. Guest first and then Dr. Kaiser.
I've been involved in quite a few cell transplantation clinical trials and also in some biomaterials clinical trials, including in people. I've been helping with Mend the Gap as an advisor for about 3 years now. It's been a really terrific experience. So I just wanted to flesh out just a few issues. The first one is, what does it really mean to mend the gap? And so we're referring here to the loss of tissue in the spinal cord, providing materials that cause new tissue to be formed in the spinal cord, and hopefully some of this new tissue includes new axons, which are what makes the connections that can restore function. And so one of the things to bear in mind is that as the clinical trials go forward, they start very carefully. They start in very early phase 1, and then they proceed through a series of systematic steps until you get to what's considered to be the pivotal study. So if you're going to be participating in a trial, you might be a participant in sort of the first in human phase. And so in that phase, you might be exposed to a lower degree of risk, but a less chance of benefit. And that's something to bear in mind as to what phase of the study you end up being assigned to. The other thing, and we have been doing such studies at the University of Miami for a few years. One of the things that we did realize in doing our studies is that sometimes one of the reasons that people volunteer for studies has to do with altruism. They truly want to be a person who's involved in moving the field forward. So sometimes the potential benefit isn't that big, for example, at the beginning or until we're able to really get the data from people as to whether it's working. And so you have to think about that to some degree, your participation in the trial is based on trying to help the field move forward. The diagram that Tanya presented was really beautiful, and I hope and wish that someday we can do our transplantations in this manner. But in the beginning, again, this will be an open surgery, so it will mean exposing the bone and spinal cord so that this can be done as safely as possible. Eventually, if that's all going well, we may be able to do this in a so-called minimally invasive manner, which wouldn't require, a reopening of the area of spinal cord injury, but could be done through the skin. Now, complications. Complications are very, very common in clinical trials like this, and they range from very frequent things, like Tanya mentioned, headaches after sort of in the first couple of weeks after the procedure. Something to be aware of is that a complication that occurs isn't necessarily permanent. And so, for example, you might wake up and have some new numbness in, for example, your arm or leg or trunk. That isn't necessarily going to be permanent. And so just something to be aware of is that some of the complications that occur around the surgery are temporary. Finally, I just wanted to mention how important rehabilitation is for this type of study. So in this type of study, we're trying to create new circuits in the system. Those circuits have to be trained, and the training requires different forms of rehabilitation. I was going to mention that sometimes in a study like this, it's easier to recover walking function than, for example, hand function. But either way, there's likely to be a commitment to participating as much as 3 times a week in significant rehabilitation. That carries with it a number of benefits, but it also means some downtime with respect to your work and also there's always some expenses. The clinical trial has tried to help you as much as possible with that. But you have to bear in mind it's not just the surgery, but it's all the other time that you need to invest in the study. So those are my comments. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be involved here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guest. Dr. Kaiser, your comments and reflections, please.
Hi, thanks. And thank you for inviting me on to share my own thoughts and perspectives on the survey. For those of you who don't know me, I know Dr. Liss introduced me. I am an individual that has been living with a spinal cord injury for over 30 years, in addition to being involved in research almost from the beginning, doing my own research as a PhD student, but also being involved, collaborating on a number of other PI projects, and also participating in research. So I sort of come at, this headspace with, seeing things from both sides. So having said that, Dr. Barretto did actually touch on a couple of the limitations that I had reflected on from the survey. Large-scale surveys do provide a great benefit to our community to get a general sense of the community's perspective on various issues. However, like she pointed out, the bots have really wreaked havoc with a lot of these surveys in recent years. So I really think like as a community, we really need to look at ways of establishing guidelines on how we recruit for these large scale surveys so we can try to reduce the errors by including invalid responses from bots that we may have missed from removing, or on the other side, excluding valid responses through that screening step. So I know there's ways that other researchers have looked at, not advertising honorariums and not posting on social media and just, recruiting within their own networks and or having like interested participants contacting the PI directly or the research team and then being provided with the survey. There's also like, I know stops that can be put in where if you complete a survey and then it's running for like several months and there's a reminder put out and you're like, oh, I don't remember if I actually did it. You go back in, it'll say, thanks, but it's already been completed. So having that so you're not getting multiple responses from the same individual. And then I don't know what you call them, but there's like those CAPTCHA things that you'll get where so I know there's different things, but I think the point is getting these guidelines in place, I think will help all of us when we're trying to do these large scale studies. The other thing I wanted to say, and again, this was touched on with the limitations, um, was that for those of us who responded to the survey, we were asked to um, determine our willingness to participate in clinical trials, both as an individual with acute injury, but also as a chronic, like present day. And it was like as someone 30 years post-injury, it was hard to go back into that headspace to think, how would I actually respond at that time? And would it have been different from the way I respond now? And I know, Dr. Barretto only had like a very short window, to give just really highlighted information about the study, but um, I would expect to see a difference in responses to willingness between acute and chronic. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I don't know how we can get around, capturing those from acute injuries, but I think it's important to realize that it may be different from those with chronic injuries. Um, and Dr. Guest brought up, a good point about the fact that uh, in today's time, the likelihood of this this surgery would be more invasive and involve open surgery. And I think it really raises a concern um, about acquiring ethical consent in individuals with acute spinal cord injury for invasive procedures because they really are such a vulnerable group. Um, and I'm worried that they may be agreeing to a level of risk that's above their normal comfort zone, uh, without really truly considering all the risks and complications that are involved with the treatment. Um, if it failed, or worst case scenario, if it led to you know, deleterious effects. And I think the follow-up for that could be um, emotionally and physically devastating for the individuals. So I think we really need to think about like, and I'm talking about us as a community, thinking about that consent process and how we can ensure that we're consenting individuals um, in a way, or making sure that consent process is detailed enough so we make sure that individuals are making informed choices. Um, One of the other things I wanted to talk about is generalizability of the findings. It was really nice to see that there was such a diverse group of responses, but it also makes me think, who did we miss? Who are the individuals that did not respond to this survey? And we know that generally non-responders tend to be individuals who do not cope well with their spinal cord injury or may be dealing with multiple morbidities. And so, again, I'm curious, would this group respond differently to the survey than those who did? So, just something to keep in mind about generalizability. It would also be really nice to see the data stratified by groups, right? So, by stratifying by level and severity of injury to see whether there's a difference in responses between, you know, a complete quad versus an incomplete para type of thing. It is interesting. Praxis, I think, through their risker studies, they've actually noticed a difference in motivation for certain interventions based on location and access to services and supports, which sort of came out a bit in your study as well. Um, then the last thing I just wanted to highlight was plex engagement and how important it is for us as researchers to include people with lived experience in research right from the beginning of the research, in the design and the conduct of the studies, and all the way through, and making sure that involvement is meaningful and not tokenistic, and they have decision-making power. So we make sure that the research that we're doing aligns with the community and it's impactful. And that's my points. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to take the opportunity as we flow into our open discussion to recognize Dr. John Madden, who is on with us. He's the principal investigator of the Men the Gap program of work, and he's raising his hand. Thank you for joining us. And I want to invite the group now to engage. And John, if you could just stay on with us, If you would like to share any reflections, I know I'm putting you on the spot without any preparation. Please feel free to do that. And we're really open for comments and questions at this point. Dr. Barretto, maybe you could put up the discussion questions that we have. And I won't read them out loud. They can just stay up here. You can see them all. But I just wonder if our panelists could give us a little bit of insight as to the target intentions for acute versus chronic injury, and if we have any more information about acute versus chronic injury priorities, concerns about risks, hopes for benefit for the two acute versus chronic injury categories. And maybe Dr. Madden and Dr. Barretto, I'll let you go for the first comment here.
So first of all, I'd just like to thank Tanya, Anita, Jim, and many others who've made this national survey happen. It's a big, and for those of you who have responded to it, and for those of you who've joined today, it's an extremely important part of Mend the Gap, and I see it as one of our major contributions. As I learn, not having a background in spinal cord injury and spinal cord injury research, I've become increasingly aware through this project of the challenges of administering a treatment, especially early on in the acute phase. And so understanding that is really critical. One thing that really brought home the challenges is just how much improvement there typically is after injury, just natural improvement. And so if we provide a treatment at that point, if we disrupt any of that improvement that would happen anyway on its own, first of all, we might not even note it. We have to make sure that we actually are aware that our treatment needs to be able to exceed that improvement that would happen naturally on its own, and that it doesn't impede it. Second, if we can make our treatment effective for chronic injury, that obviously has the ability to affect a much larger population, and a population that have reached a much more stable phase, a population who can understand the risks much better. And so we are really aware of that, and would love to make contributions also to the chronic injury. We are in our current phase still in a state where we are trying to prove the various treatments that we're investigating. And so we don't have any magic or scientifically validated treatments that are ready to roll out. We're still very much in a discovery phase. There's some promising aspects, but we don't have anything yet that we can roll out as being anywhere close to a cure. So thank you again to the team for making this conversation possible, and for the national survey. And I'll turn it back to Tanya.
Thank you, John. Thank you to Dr. Guest and Dr. Kaiser as well for their really, really insightful and thoughtful comments. And just to address some of them, we did see when we asked about participating in an acute trial versus a chronic trial, we did see a little bit of a difference when we parsed out the level of injury. So for example, in an acute injury, people with cervical injuries were a bit more reluctant to participate in that compared to in a chronic stage. And so these are all just preliminary results as such, and that's why I didn't really present them here today. But when we looked a little bit further, there were more sort of social demographics that like came up, like for example, people living alone, their relationship status, that actually impacted what their functional priorities might be. And, we know that, activities of daily living, just being able to do that are really important in the community and supporting that. But I think what this is gives us some preliminary information to guide the science that we are actually doing and developing. Because if we see that there are different responses between different groups, that really helps the scientists sort of like tailor different just treatment options at this point. And so I think this also then informs how we will do the focus groups and the interviews and maybe stratify those by different injury levels and severities and see what comes up with that. So I think this is just lays the foundation for all of that work going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Guest, Dr. Kaiser, do you want to weigh in here?
There actually was a question in the chat about the axonal growth that would occur in a gap. So we know a lot from the preclinical studies about what can happen there. And so what can happen in the animal models is that some new circuits can be formed. We call them sort of like bypass circuits or indirect circuits. And they can be associated with improvements in recovery. That has happened in both sort of like thoracic spinal injuries affecting the lower limbs and also in cervical injuries. I think to the question about acute versus chronic. So from a scientist point of view, one of the advantages of chronic injury is that it's much easier to get the baseline and to really understand when there is a beneficial or harmful effect. So it's a more sensitive, what we call readout, when you start from that situation. Something that's very encouraging is that through the use of neuromodulation, we have been learning that people with chronic spinal cord injury do have potential for recovery and neuroplasticity. So the idea of starting with people who have chronic injury is actually quite solid at this point in terms of recovery potential. And I think that from a safety point of view, there's a lot of advantages there. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Doctor, yeah, go ahead.
I would agree with Dr. Guest. Like my field of expertise is in activity-based therapy, and we've definitely seen potential for improvements in neurological recovery in individuals with chronic injuries. And that includes individuals with complete injuries. So I think pairing any of these types of procedures with a rehab program following would be ideal and could potentially benefit anyone, regardless of level, severity, or time post-injury. In terms of these questions, I really like that you're going to follow this up with like interviews and focus groups, because I think this is where you can really, ask the community how they feel about some of these key questions that you're asking. And I think, again, that's what's really important is it's not just the perspective of one individual, but it's getting a perspective from a variety and diverse group of individuals, and then and looking at that overall.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge participant Sam, who has joined us and puts a very important series of questions in the chat box, some of which are reflected actually in the discussion questions that we have up as well, as well as the question about sprouting axons and how we'll know if they make the intended connections. So I'm hoping our audience will weigh in with questions and comments of your own. Just two of my own that I want to just bring to the table. One is a comment that goes back to, probably 30 years of genetic studies when we were starting to identify the Huntington gene, for example. And of course, that's a very different kind of neurologic condition. It's a progressive condition, and one that deteriorates over time rather than stabilizes over time. And one of the questions that collaborators from the ethics community investigated was whether people would be um, uh, interested in having a genetic test for Huntington's disease. And at the time, the response to that question was absolutely yes, we would want to have a genetic test. And then once the genetic test was made available, there started to be quite a reluctance to actually going forward for genetic testing because, in part, there was no therapeutic intervention that was available to ameliorate or at least slow down the progression of the disease. So we know very much from our science and our research that asking questions that are anticipatory and hypothetical in nature in the biosciences is actually very challenging because as much as people can imagine wanting to participate, wanting to know, sometimes when the rubber hits the road, it's not as easy as it seemed when you were just imagining participating or seeking testing. So I think we have to accept prior work in the research community as a similar limitation in this kind of work that we're doing, and hopefully those effects will be mitigated as we actually work one-on-one with individuals with spinal cord injury and in focus groups, because the richness of the dialogue can really bring out some of the hesitations and the realities and concerns about receptivity to a biomaterials approach, for example. And the other comment that I have is with Dr. Kwan and Dr. Tetzlaff, who's also participating today. We did a large series of studies around stem cell research and spinal cord injury. And whereas at the time we had predicted that individuals with cervical injuries would be most receptive to experimental interventions, we actually discovered that we were flatly wrong, and that in fact people with cervical injuries, so those most injured, were the most risk averse. And what we learned from follow on to our surveys in working with individuals one-on-one and in focus groups is that the risk of losing any retained function was the greatest concern for that population, and that those with thoracic injuries and those who were further out from the post-injury phase were actually more prone to taking risks than those more severely injured and those in the earlier phases of work. So we will bear those results from the stem cell research in mind as we go forward around these biomaterial questions as well. So we are inviting comments and questions.
I think one of the biggest questions I want to ask here is, around the interview versus a focus group, right? Like having a focus group would be great because, participants can feed off of each other and you can maybe get richer data. But it might be an access challenge. And like Dr. Kaiser mentioned, that, there are people that have not responded for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're not doing so great. Maybe they don't have the supports in place. And I think maybe interviews might help better with that. And I would really wonder some feedback on whether we do one or the other or both, or what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm going to conduct a little experiment here and see if it works. We have 40 people joining us. If you think you would prefer to participate in a focus group, put F in the chat box. And if you prefer an interview, just type I in the chat box. And we'll just let the chat box populate for the next few seconds so that Tanya can get an answer to her question. So F for focus group, I for interview. And focus groups, they can all be done virtually. Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. We're looking for close to 40 responses in the chat box. Please keep it coming. Thank you.
Dr. Barretto, I'm wondering even if you can do a combination of the two. I've seen in some studies where they have done that, they would hold focus groups and then also have select one-on-one interviews. And maybe it's a matter of not, the timing not working out for individuals to be able to participate in a focus group that they'll do the one-on-one. But sometimes having a mix of both, it's nice to see because like you said, you could get nice detailed responses through focus groups where individuals are feeding off one another, but you could get something also very different through a one-on-one interview.
Well, that's a great point where people can, are a bit more comfortable expressing themselves and really getting down into some of the details. That would be great.
Yeah. No, we will. I absolutely do both according to people's preferences, and that's been our approach in the past as well, especially respecting people's availability, accessibility, schedules, and so forth. Dr. Guest, your hand is up, and then Dr. Tetzlaff, I'm gonna queue you up to make any comments if you'd like to share some of your thoughts with us. But first, Dr. Guest.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to make a couple more comments about the altruism part. One of the things about being involved in studies like this is that you end up getting a tremendous diagnosis of your status of your spinal cord injury and also your health at the time. You may learn things about your function that you otherwise wouldn't be aware of. You're often introduced to new rehabilitation programs and techniques that you might not otherwise have been able to access. So I do think that there are also these aspects of being involved in a clinical trial that can provide benefits to people. I just want them to keep that in mind as they think about this question of being a volunteer in a study. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Tetzlaff, I queued you up. Is there anything you want to contribute?
Yes. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your hard work. I have a question to Tanya. The actual priorities that came out in your survey strike me as there would need a fragmentation into who is cervically, who is thoracically injured, and thereby having people indicating, okay, it's understandable that a leg function is very much desired by a person with a thoracic injury as opposed to hand function, obviously by the cervical injury. But I was surprised that sexual bowel and autonomic function was so far on the right side of the spectrum, as this is very much emphasized in our center and in the Kim Anderson review that is now 20 years old. It was also there in the breakdown between the two. So maybe we need to get some granular information, more granular information, who really wanted was. And I think it's important to then see what type of people would be willing for a biomaterial intervention with regards to the level of injury, completeness of injury, and so on, because that matters with regards to the enrollment and the understanding how to do a trial. So I really think you're on the right track here, but we need more granularity.
Oh, absolutely, Dr. Tetzlaff. So we are doing the breakdown, and there are a couple of trends that are showing up. So in terms of functional priorities compared to, for example, the Anderson paper, this question was very specific in relation to this intervention as opposed to the general priorities that they may require. So, I could argue that given the risks involved with this, the payout should be higher, and maybe that's why there's a little bit more focus on the hand and leg function. And so yes, we have seen a couple of different trends pop up when we've looked at the functional priorities based on different things. For example, like I mentioned, people living alone want a little bit more hand function compared to people who have a caregiver at home that could help them with things. But yeah, I think that's very interesting, and we are definitely working on breaking that down. And I'm absolutely happy to share those data with you sometime soon.
Thank you. Keep up your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to jump in and say our informal survey is still open, probing for whether you would prefer to be in a focus group. You put an F if you have not answered yet, or an I for interview if you have not answered yet. And I'm going to offer you, those of you who have not answered yet, a third option, which is an N for neither. So please, if you haven't answered, just throw an F or an I or an N into the chat box. Thank you very much. Dr. Kaiser, you're up.
Yeah, I just want to make one more point that was brought up a little bit earlier. And again, it goes back to individuals and how they would respond based on whether they're, acute or chronic. But I think we also have to recognize like there's diversity within the population, right? That, individuals with higher level injuries may respond differently from those with lower or, complete injuries versus incomplete, but also just recognizing the individualized nature of people's spinal cord injuries. For example, that could affect their level of motivation to willing to participate in clinical trials. So, for example, someone newly injured may have a really positive outlook on life. And so they're very resilient and can bounce back and cope really well with their injury and feel like I don't want to go through an invasive procedure that carries a lot of risk. Whereas the others may not have a positive outlook on life and be desperate for something to fix them, quote unquote. The alternative is someone may be well adjusted for 10 years and then all of a sudden start dealing with a number of complications. And so their response may change. And where at one point they may not be interested in this type of procedure, maybe 10 years plus down the road, as they're aging with the spinal cord injury, dealing with a lot of complications, this now may become more appealing. So recognizing that, I don't think it's going to be a really clear-cut answer of this is really suited for acute or really suited for chronic or certain levels. It's really going to be individualized. And this is where having a really strong consent and screening process to understand the psychological, the emotional state of the individual, their motivations for doing this type of surgery is going to be really important in deciding who should be getting it and who not.
Oh, absolutely, Dr. Kaiser. Thank you. I would have wanted, a straightforward answer that we could generalize because that would make things easier, right? But it is going to be an individualistic, and we've seen that in our ethics study, right? There is what is called intersectionality, different factors that intersect together that then influence a person's outcome or a person's choices. And, I think that is something that we have to consider. But I also wonder how easy or difficult that might actually be in reality at the end of the day. But it is definitely worthwhile investigating further.
Dr. Guess, can you speak to screening protocols completely separate from consent for selecting individuals who are good candidates for clinical trials? Can you tell us a little bit about that from your experience?
Sure. So sometimes screening takes a while. So if we were to use this as an example, and if we were to say that it would be for a chronic injury, probably the first element of screening would be to put some information out about the study and also to put out what we call the inclusion and exclusion criteria so that people can have an idea about whether it's remotely possible that they would be able to participate in the study or not. Now, there has been a change in the way that we do things in the last decade. So actually now, because we have very rich databases of individuals who indicate their willingness to participate in clinical trials, sometimes we actually will use our data and then contact the individual and give them information, ask them about it. Then as we get into a more formal screening, it's necessary to come in for a visit. to have a neurologic evaluation. And then if everything is looking good, probably have to move forward into detailed imaging, because imaging would be really important for this type of procedure. Sometimes we also like to make sure that the person really understands what they're getting into. And so now that I've actually moved from screening to consent, so I'll maybe stop because you asked me about screening.
Well, in the last 2 minutes, consent is really the holy grail, right? Of making sure, as we saw from the data, and as we know from now 30 or 40 years of bioethics literature and work, that transparency is key. But I just know, I think about the screening process in terms of equity and clinical equipoise, and just ensuring that individuals who are potentially eligible have the kind of access that we wish for them to have, and that no screening process actually ends up being exclusionary for reasons of bias, and so forth.
That has a lot to do with the funding for the study, and I fully agree with you. But people are different, they're resourced in very different ways. So it's important that the study at the outset, as you're trying to get the grant for the study, allows for a substantial transportation costs and even some recompense sometimes for time off work and things like that, in order to make it possible that we can recruit a wide variety of individuals, as you're saying.
All right, very good. Thank you. We're down to the last 30 seconds on the clock. I'm going to invite anyone who wishes to jump in from our audience before I ask Dr. Kaiser, Dr. Guest, and Barretto for their last word. Anyone from who's joined us in the Zoom room? Okay, Dr. Guest, I'm going to give you the first last word.
Well, I wish I had heard more expressed questions today. Please don't be shy about that. And I hope that no question is too probing, no question is silly. So please feel free to use whatever contacts are available to get the information that you need. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Dr. Barretto?
Oh, no, I wanted to thank, our panelists for taking the time to share their thoughts on this, especially as someone who was a basic science researcher and now in this more, engagement field. It was very eye-opening doing the survey for me, and just really reinforced the importance of engaging the community throughout the process. It is challenging because, my brain is a bit different. But it is extremely valuable and extremely important. And I would really like feedback about how we can continue to do that. So please, if you're a bit shy, I will put my email in the chat, and, you can always reach out to me with your comments if you would like, because that is really important. Thank you.
Dr. Kaiser, the last word.
Oh, I just want to say I'm really glad that this work is being undertaken. It's so important to the SCI community. And again, just reiterating what Dr. Barretto said about the importance of including people with spinal cord injury throughout this research process, so we can make sure it aligns with the interests of the community. And, we can help with the design and the administration of the study, and ensure that there's success with recruitment and hopefully, positive outcomes.
All right, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. And for those of you who have joined us today, I'm going to call this webinar, bring it to a close, and look forward to seeing all of you again soon, and to your participation into the next phases of this work. Bye-bye, everyone.